Welcome to the Paul Talk Science podcast. Today, we have a timely and important conversation about the race to develop a vaccine for the Marburg virus. Marburg is a rare but deadly viral hemorrhagic fever that has recently emerged in Rwanda, sparking global concern. Joining us is Mark Feinberg, the President and CEO of the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, IAVI. The initiative has been working on the Marburg vaccine candidate for years, and their efforts have taken on new urgency with this latest outbreak. In this interview, Mark will share insights on IAVI's vaccine development process, the current stage of the pipeline, and the challenges of preparing for unpredictable outbreaks like Marburg. We'll also discuss the broader landscape of global health preparedness and the need for coordinated responses to emerging infectious diseases. This is a fascinating look at the high-stakes work happening behind the scenes to protect us from deadly viruses. Let's dive into the conversation. Where were you when you first heard about the Marburg virus disease situation in Rwanda, and how did it connect to the candidates that IAVI has been working on for years? So that is the point I would like us to start from.
First got involved in dealing with viral hemorrhagic fever outbreaks in the 2014 to 2016 Ebola Zaire outbreak, which, as you know, was very severe in West Africa, the largest Ebola outbreak ever. And that sort of the way these things start, at least for me, is I start getting phone calls from colleagues of mine in the field who are, aware of unexplained or explained threats that are newly emerging, and as is often the case, you get one call and then you start getting multiple calls, and you learn more about the specific details of what's going on. And as you can imagine, in the early stages, there's not a lot of specific information, and sometimes the information that is available early on isn't necessarily complete or accurate. So you need to sort of not rush to conclusions and just do your best to get additional information. The information, was in the case of the Rwanda Marburg outbreak, came pretty quickly. So after I started, hearing from, outreach from various colleagues, the Rwandan government officially announced that there was a Marburg outbreak, and then that, as you can imagine, activates a number of different activities, both for an organization like mine as well as the community of global health researchers who are involved in the development of vaccines and other medical countermeasures against diseases like Marburg.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So what is the current situation before I start taking you back down memory lane? So what is the current situation? What is IVI? Because I know your candidate vaccine project has been on for years. I remember in 2019 when there was a major multi-million-dollar grant from the US government to support this particular vaccine candidate.
Yeah.
Before we're talking about it. So what stage is a candidate currently at?
Yeah. No, as you say, we've been working on this for at least 4 years or so, and in that period of time, we have done extensive characterization of the vaccine candidate in preclinical models, which the major preclinical model that is used for diseases like the viral hemorrhagic fevers is often non-human primates, where they're challenged with the pathogenic viruses, and the vaccine candidates are evaluated for their ability to protect the animals from getting infected and getting sick. Our candidate has performed exceptionally well in those situations, with high level efficacy across a range of doses, with the onset of immunity happening very quickly after vaccination, and the immune responses being very durable, all of which are elicited by a single dose of the vaccine. So that is, very favorable characteristics for vaccines that target outbreak-associated pathogens like Marburg. Um, to get a vaccine into the clinic, as you know, involves a lot of additional work. You need to do preclinical safety and toxicology studies, biodistribution studies. You need to develop assays that are able to be used in clinical trials, and you need to work with regulatory authorities to make sure you have a proper, trial design, and you need to, prepare the candidate so that it can be manufactured at scale and then conduct the manufacturing of the clinical trial material. So that is kind of where we're at now. We are in the process of manufacturing the vaccine for use in clinical trials, but that process takes time, and we're working to do everything we can to expedite the availability of our vaccine candidate. But our hope is actually that the Rwandan health authorities will bring this outbreak under control so that you actually wouldn't be able to test the efficacy of a vaccine. But and if that happens in the near future, we likely would not be able to have our vaccine evaluated in the current outbreak. But that being said, as I'm sure you've noticed, these outbreaks seem to be occurring more frequently, and they're also occurring in countries where they haven't been seen before, like Rwanda. So we definitely need to be prepared. And unfortunately, a number of the other candidates that are being advanced by other developers are also apparently not, there are not doses available that could be used in clinical trials. To the best of my knowledge, there's only one organization that has a candidate vaccine that they have doses that could be utilized in a clinical study, and I believe that they are, clearly being considered by the Rwandan government for potential studies of that vaccine, but that hasn't been formally announced. That vaccine candidate is being advanced by the Sabin Vaccine Institute.
Okay, I think I'll put back a remark that why didn't we have some at least basic clinical data that could have made it easy for these your candidates to go into clinical trial, even though we are looking at outbreaks, at least data on safety in human use.
Yeah.
Um, why has that not been made available over the years?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is there was a time when people thought we didn't need vaccines against diseases like Ebola and Marburg. Um, that the diseases could just be controlled by public health measures like quarantine, isolation, um, and proper, protective practices. Um, that conclusion, I think, was called into question with the Ebola Zaire outbreak in 2014 to 2016, because that clearly was out of control for a period of time. It ultimately was controlled. And the other issue was that, prior to that outbreak, people felt that even if you developed a vaccine and had demonstrated safety and immunogenicity of the vaccine, the ability to induce an immune response, that you wouldn't be able to test efficacy of the vaccine. And that also was shown to be inaccurate because the Merck Ebola vaccine, or Vibo, was studied in an outbreak in Guinea towards the end of the 2014 to 2016 outbreak, and in a ring vaccination study was shown to be highly efficacious, and that supported the ultimate regulatory approval of that vaccine and its use for dealing with Ebola Zaire outbreaks. But unfortunately, there is not cross-protective immunity across these different filoviruses. So a vaccine for Marburg would require a Marburg-specific vaccine, and that candidate is one that we've been actively working to advance. But vaccine development takes time and it takes money, and the money, the developers of these vaccines now are largely not-for-profit public sector institutions rather than, pharmaceutical companies. And we're dependent on public sector funding for the work we do. And that means that, you need to identify sources of funding and, get funded, through grant proposals to do that work and then do the work. But the magnitude of the resources available, the more resources you have, the faster you can move. And when resources are more constrained, you cannot move as quickly. So we're moving as quickly as we possibly can and are appreciative of the funding we have for these programs. But you know, it's it just means we need to, this outbreak is again a reminder that we need to move as expeditiously as we can, and hopefully within the context of a broader coordinated response where there's adequate investment to develop vaccines and other interventions, especially, treatments and for people who are infected with the virus.
That's a very, very interesting take. And I think it also brings this conversation to a broader angle on how do we decide where to spend the limited, or let me say finite research on vaccine research on. Every now and then a disease pops up and we start mobilizing funds to address that disease and to expedite actions on research into that field. So I know you've seen this is not the first rodeo regarding emergency response and quickly trying to see what can be done. So
Yeah.
ideally, what do you think works best? And in order to prevent this constant desire to now let's quickly address this, let's quickly something else comes up tomorrow, we are
Yeah.
moving into that direction. So what is your best approach or
Yeah,
advice on this?
that's a really important question. After the 2014 to 2016 outbreak, which made exactly the point that you made, is you need to be better prepared for these things. You can't just respond to them when they arise. That sentiment gave rise to the creation of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or called CEPI by the acronym. And CEPI, that is kind of CEPI's mission to identify what are the pathogens that have the greatest potential of emerging and causing significant outbreaks or even pandemics, and then to fund vaccine research to, advance candidates that could be ready for use when an outbreak occurs. And that's a priority for CEPI, and I think that's a very important role that CEPI plays. But the challenge is broader than that. I mean, CEPI is one organization. What one needs, I think, is a highly integrated, proactive, and strategic partnership among all the relevant organizations that are working in the global health research and development space, as well as the organizations that are involved in the procurement and delivery of, vaccines and other treatments to address these emerging infectious disease threats. And that's still a work in progress. CEPI does not, or at least has not until recently, had Marburg as one of its priority pathogens. I mean, I think that may change when they see the, frequency of how these outbreaks are occurring. Um, but the question you asked is a fundamentally important one where I think progress has been made in this space, but there's more work to do. I think when you're in these periods of not having outbreaks, you know, the attention to this threat tends to wane and it only reemerges when there is an outbreak. So I guess that's, kind of human nature, but we need to recognize that these threats are out there and they're going to continue to represent, public health crises, and we can and we must do better to address this issue.
So if you bring it back to this Marburg virus vaccine pipeline, realistically, what do you think could be the key metric in terms of what can be realistic in terms of expectations for an ideal Marburg vaccine
Yeah.
and the reality of what we currently have in the pipeline?
Yeah. Well, I can't speak to the other vaccine candidates being advanced by others, but I can speak to our candidate. So it is based on the vesicular stomatitis virus or VSV platform, which is the exact same platform that's utilized in the Merck Ebola Zaire vaccine or Vivo. The preclinical data for the Ebola Zaire vaccine demonstrated high-level efficacy with a single dose of the vaccine and durable immune responses. In our preclinical studies, the Marburg vaccine behaves exactly the same way. So we're optimistic that the vaccine has meaningful promise to be safe and efficacious, but obviously we need to demonstrate that in people. And we're working hard to get our candidate manufactured so that it's available for use in clinical trials. And if it's not available for use in the current outbreak or the current outbreak is controlled by public health measures before you can actually test a vaccine, hopefully we'll have it available in sufficient quantity that it can be rapidly utilized for studies in the next outbreak. And if it's shown to be efficacious, hopefully it could be a tool that could be used for future outbreaks, just the way that the Merck Ebola Zaire vaccine or Vivo is currently the sort of gold standard for dealing with Ebola Zaire outbreaks.
Yes, I was speaking with some leaderships of the WHO yesterday regarding potential emergency use listing for any of these candidates, including yours, and the response was flatline that there is no vaccine candidate that has gotten to that level that has enough evidence to justify that emergency use listing.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
continue to see conversations by African governments, having interactions directly with manufacturers like you that have some candidates around that. So, in the light of the current dynamics in public health and the way the emergency use listing qualification is set up, and the desires of countries to have candidates that could potentially provide some protection for their citizens.
yeah.
What is the assessment of these dynamics? What do you think should be the reality in terms of the key requirement of these listings
Yeah.
condition?
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree with the WHO statement. I mean, there are no Marburg vaccines for which there is sufficient data that would justify, emergency use listing of any type. I mean, not only do you need um, efficacy data to justify that, but you also need to have a good understanding of the safety of the vaccine as well as the safety of the vaccine in all populations where you're going to need it, which means not only adults, but children. You need data from pregnant women because pregnant women are often have more severe consequences of these infections. So you need a lot of safety data, and ideally you would also have efficacy data because you can imagine you can't justify ethically the use of an intervention for which you don't know whether it's safe and efficacious. And if for some reason you deploy something without adequate data and you subsequently find out that there's a problem, a safety problem that was previously unappreciated, then you run the risk of losing public trust, and that would be a very bad outcome. So I agree with the WHO statement that they made to you, but I also believe that we need to do all we can to generate that data so that we have these countermeasures available for rapid deployment when future outbreaks occurs, which I think is going to require more research and development, more investment, and better alignment of the global health stakeholders.
Yeah, interesting, interesting. So, Then I also have this question around multiple vaccine candidates being tested at the same time, in the light of choosing which one to implement.
Yeah,
What are your concerns around which one should we green light? Is it probably one that is still not yet at that stage that is potentially showing more promising results? Do we think this is more responsibility for government or the regulators, or more about the manufacturers themselves, people like organizations like you that have candidates in the pipeline,
yeah,
at least providing some basic patient safety data?
yeah,
So even though when these things are ready, if there is an outbreak that we can test them, that evidence is available, and it will be
yeah,
much easier to have that approval.
yeah. So in terms of the prioritization among different candidates, as I'm sure you know, the WHO actually does have a process for doing that, where they look at what data are available for the different candidates in development, and they make a recommendation about what they think is the priority candidate. So for instance, when there was an Ebola Sudan outbreak, they prioritized the use of our Ebola vaccine, our Ebola Sudan candidate. For the Marburg vaccine, my understanding is they've prioritized the Sabin Vaccine Institute candidate, which is a adenovirus candidate. And one major reason why they prioritize that was that that's the only one that's available for use in clinical trials at the present time. So as each candidate generates additional data, that would feed into the WHO prioritization process about which candidate or candidates to prioritize. Um, but it does mean that generating that data to inform those decisions is really important. And there's, ongoing efforts to generate that data. And that's something that we're actively involved in and doing everything we can to make that happen as quickly as possible.
So now, how will you describe what activity? We have a lot of outbreaks at the moment, and opportunities to test new vaccines from the perspective of a vaccine manufacturer, researcher, or entity. So, um, what is happening in terms of activities around investment, attraction, donations to support research? So how would you describe the current trend in your sector?
Well, I mean, there is funding available for this work. I think more funding would allow um, the work to proceed more quickly, but also organizations like mine or the other developers are not working in a vacuum. We rely on other partners to work with us to really think about how we plan for the future, so that if our candidate is safe and efficacious, how is it actually going to be made available to people who need it, which means what will be the basis for regulatory approval, what will be the decisions made about who's going to procure the vaccine, who's going to deliver the vaccine. Governments need to prioritize use of the vaccine. Um, you know, so there's a lot of work to be done, and we're engaged in those activities now, even though we're at an early stage, and I think those are going to be very important, but there's more work to do there.
Well, what are your last thoughts for me going forward?
No, I mean, thank you for your interest, and I think it's really important that the public have access to accurate information about these issues, and I appreciate your efforts in that regard. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It has been an interesting conversation, exciting, and of course, yeah. So enjoy the rest of your day.